Hello everybody and welcome to the PraxisAuril SHEDTalk, the second in our SHEDTalk series, and so called because I, Sean Fielding, Director of Innovation, Impact and Business at University of Exeter and Chair of PraxisAuril, am hosting these talks from my shed at the bottom of my garden in Torquay on the English Riviera. And that has resembled the real Riviera over the past week, but today has now reverted to form. And you may hear rain hammering on the roof of the shed during this, the course of this session. Don't adjust your sets, that's normal for Torquay. We've reverted back to normal state here. We're joined today by Tony Soteriou, who's been appointed to the new role of Director of Research Commercialisation for UKRI. Tony, welcome to the shed.
Hello, thank you, Sean. Thank you.
And great to see you're in your own shed today. Very impressive.
Amazing technology.
And before we go on to the talk itself, I'd like to introduce Maxine Ficara, the CEO of PraxisAuril, who's going to explain the rules for today.
Hi Sean, thank you. Hope you can hear me okay. I know you can't see my video at the moment, but I'll continue. Great to have so many of you online with us today. I was hoping for seaside sound effects as we dialed in so that we could imagine we were in sunny Brighton, but no matter, we've got a shed talk from the South Coast instead. So just a few very brief housekeeping points for today. We've got quite a large group on this call, so we need to keep the bandwidth under control. So we're turning off participant video and sound throughout. Of course, the whole point of this session is to allow you to ask questions of our guest speakers. So we'll be using the chat function to log those. So you should see that at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I'll be keeping track of all your questions alongside Sean and the exec team who are on the call behind the scenes. So just send your questions in as you think of them. You don't need to wait to be asked. We'll do our best to queue you up appropriately. This is important. Can you please remember to note your full name and your organisation when you ask a question, especially if your Zoom account is a personal one, because it may have a really random name and we won't know who you are or where you're from. So please try and remember to do that if you can. If you are having any difficulties on the call, then just use that private chat function as well to contact the PraxisAuril meeting host. To remind you that we're recording the session today and it's going to be made available after the event to the PRA community. And to say also that we can continue conversations around topics of interest that are raised today via our online discussion forum, and we can also use that to cover off any questions we don't have time for. But if you need any information about how to access that, then just use the chat to send the team here a note. I think that's it. Sean, over to you.
Thank you very much, Maxine. So, so we're today in this shed talk talking about research commercialization and with UKRI. And I wanted to start with Tony by asking him to tell us something about his background. You've been involved in this world in various ways for many years, Tony.
Yeah, well, firstly, thank you again for inviting me to this, and hello to everyone joining in and listening in and joining into the event online. So thank you. Delighted to be with you today. So yeah, as you say, I'm relatively new to UK research and innovation. So I joined in February and delighted to be within the new role. My background is very sort of research focused. So I spent the last 25, 27 years working in a variety of sectors and a variety of organisations. So to go right back, it's a bit interview sort of style. I did a PhD and postdoc in biochemistry. So I did my PhD in Cardiff and my postdoc in Bristol. Then after that, I decided that, well, I think I probably decided I wasn't quite cut out for working in the lab. So I went to work for the Medical Research Council, got a job at head office, which was a fantastic revelation for me. Moving out of the lab, I actually really loved doing my PhD and my postdoc, but it was really a revelation, the fact that you could sort of step back and still use the skills that I had from research, but sort of apply them in a policy sort of strategic and operational context. So I worked a number of things at MRC, worked on international HIV trials, worked on CJD as the news was breaking around sort of BSc and CJD links, and also trials, a lot of work on trials. So that was really exciting. And then after that, I had a couple of posts in the NHS, including a Director of R&D for an NHS Trust. For the last 9 years, I've been at the Department of Health and Social Care, part of the senior R&D team, and I had responsibility, among other things, for working with industry and R&D relations, and for translation and translational research. So that was really interesting. And throughout my career, I've sort of worked, my research career, I've worked sort of at the interface between sort of universities, government-funded research, and industry. So that sort of provided the background for me taking this role.
So at this point, I probably ought to ask you the Mrs. Merton question, which is, what is it that attracted you to the multi-billion-pound UKRI organisation? What made you think that working for UKRI would be a good idea at the moment?
So yeah, there's a number of things. So it's the first, so as you say, I think absolutely. I think the potential to make a difference, I know it's a bit of a cliche, but to make a difference in the research environment. I really sort of enjoy national roles. So I sort of enjoyed having sort of roles that I could try to make an impact sort of nationally and have a role in sort of helping to shape things. So that's really, I guess, what attracted me to this role. I mean, UKRI is a relatively new organisation. It's 2 years old now. We've just announced a new chief exec joining in this month, taking over from Sir Mark Walpole. We've done a fantastic job creating UKRI. But I think the interesting thing that excited me is that this is a new role, a new function in a relatively new organisation where governance, structure, culture is just developing. And as you said, I think the potential, you know, within the ecosystem that UKRI can potentially have, if it really maximises its sort of efforts in commercialisation, I think is you know, really exciting. I think obviously it's UK wide. And has, you know, and is uniquely placed with sort of a bit of clout of funding. So you've got a good carrot there in terms of helping to work with your partners. But I do think it is really about working with partners. And so that's what sort of attracted me to the role.
Yeah, and it's a new role, isn't it? So they clearly think that research commercialization is important. They created this role and this activity. So why do you think it's important now for UKRI to do this?
So I think, yeah, I think it's important for a number of reasons really, and partly linked to the last issue around the fact that UKRI is a relatively new organisation. So I think there's two parts to that answer, to that question, I think. So first of all, as I said, it's a new organisation which is predominantly brings together, as you know, research councils that have, you know, each of them have an excellent track record in their own areas of funding fundamental basic discovery research and science, and they're well known for that and do a great job with that overall. Also brings together Innovate UK and Research England into the organisation, so that's great. So I think one of the things that we need to do is actually how do we maximise the benefit of those original organisations coming together into a single new organisation. So that's one thing. I think that there's a recognition that there's a number of sort of underpinning central functions that's needed for the new organisation. So another example is with UKRI, we've created a Director of Skills and a Central Skills function. There's infrastructure functions. There's a number of functions, and this is one of a small number of sort of 3 or 4 functions that has been decided. We decided that we need to have a central sort of push to bring together those, you know, the activity in this space. So that's one thing. I think the need to bring together sort of disparate activity for good reasons that's been developed across the individual councils. All of that good, but I think really we need to be able to look, sort of put your head up and look above that and say what's working well, what do we want to scale up, what isn't working well. And then the other side, I think the acknowledgement, while the predominant activity is funding, as I said, research funding that basic discovery research, but I think the need and actually the willingness and the wantingness to sort of show that actually, yes, the research does have an impact. And of course, commercialization is there's only one, but an important way of demonstrating that research has an impact. And I think UKRI wants to sort of, I guess, up our game in terms of our focus on that, not at the expense of funding fundamental basic discovery research, but as well as, and we want to up our game. And I think that that's really, I mean, it's been part of overall sort of government sort of language and focus for quite some time, the need for research to demonstrate impact. And as I say, this is a really important way of doing it.
Yeah, and I think I'll probably want to come back to that question a bit later on about what you see as the, what does your role mean for that emphasis, I think, in research projects as we go. Just thinking about structural things though at the beginning, you've got Research England and also Innovate UK in the UKRI garden, if you like. And you've also got other knowledge exchange initiatives and public engagement initiatives going on around the sector. How do you make sure that all of these things don't get tangled up? You know, are you able to find some clear space and clear water for you, do you think?
So I think the key thing for me as far as my role, the way I see my role in the function is, first of all, it's not a centralisation agenda. So we're not trying to create empires within UKRI, increase bureaucracy. That's certainly not the aim. What we want to do.
Everyone says that.
Well, they do say that, and of course, bureaucracy breed bureaucracies, of course. But I think that's certainly a marker of success. I think if we end up, you know, increasing bureaucracy and making it more difficult, then that would have failed. But I think what we want to do is, I think what I see my role as it's an interesting role because, you know, if we're going to be successful, it would be working in partnership, in pure collaboration with each of the councils, each of the schemes within UKRI that's within this area. So I think absolutely, I see my job absolutely is working with each of the research councils, but also, of course, working very closely with Research England and Innovate UK, but also importantly with devolved administrations, of course, outside UKRI. And I've started having conversations with the devolved administrations. I've spoken to colleagues in Scotland yesterday, in Wales last week, because obviously UKRI is UKRI in terms of the research and innovation funding. So we need to make sure that it gels. So I think it's a question of really not, you know, working out what's working. Don't try and fix what isn't broken, but actually trying to make sure there's a better evidence base within UKRI for making decisions about what is working, deciding on the basis of evidence what schemes and what things we should be aiming to scale up, and ideally getting additional funding from government. Yeah.
So it's quite a sort of macro level role in that sense, trying to make things more streamlined, trying to raise the profile of this activity, trying to generate more funds, make more funds available. I see there's a question from Adam Giangreco about the sort of direct commercialization role of UKRI. And I think we might come to that as we go along. I'll keep a track of that, Adam, and come back to it if we haven't answered that question. But let's start with this question of commercialization, and what do you mean by commercialization, and how do you judge, how are you going to measure, you know, moving things along the track towards towards success, whatever success is described at. What do you see as your kind of measurement for moving along the scale?
So first of all, I think the question about how you define commercialization is really important, I think. And I also sort of feel guilty that I had initial focus on that when I joined UKRI, feeling that I was going to sort of almost make enemies, saying, you know, everyone's going to say, well, we know what commercialization is, why are we wasting time? But actually what I found is nearly every single meeting that I had, both internally and externally, asked me that question: how are we defining commercialization? What was really interesting, of course, is that, you know, while there's within UKRI, there's three fundamental perspectives for funding commercialization, as we talked about. So we've got Research England funding through high, RED fundings, connecting capability funding. We've got Innovate UK for business-led innovation and commercialisation. And then, of course, we've got research councils. But that underlies there is a single research council view on what commercialisation is. And of course, there's very different disciplines have different view and culture about this. So I was really keen to broaden the definition of commercialisation to make sure it was as inclusive as possible. And the way we're defining it is it's around technologies, but not just technologies. It's around products, processes, services, and technologies. And it's about the process of taking those to market. And we can talk about what we mean by market in a second. So first of all, it's that broad definition. I think that's really important going forward, particularly as we're in a sort of era of data-driven services, those sorts of things, which I think we want to include within the commercialisation umbrella. And then I think how do we track it, and what do we mean by that? And for me, I think it's obviously there's the obvious around technology development and technology readiness levels, but I also think that when we're funding commercialisation activities, we also want to ensure that there's an intent and sort of mindset to move things along the commercial readiness level as well. So I think it's the TRL and or CRL, so technical as well as commercial readiness. And I think that provides a framework that the ideal is when we're awarding funding is to move to a situation that we allow longer term funding to researchers and to others and businesses, but stage gate those based on the development of a TRL and CRL type framework. So that's how I think we were sort of tracking it. And that seems to hit a note within UKRI across the disciplines, because I think that some of the disciplines were very worried about a very technology TRL type focus of commercialisation.
Yes, because effectively you've got an overarching responsibility across some very different research council areas, ranging from culture and policy development all the way through to drug development. So you've got to find a way of measuring movement across that whole range.
So yeah, absolutely. And we also want to be inclusive, so I think what we don't want to give the impression, particularly when we're talking to, the social scientists, for example, or, natural environment researchers, that it's purely about technology. In many cases it will be, of course, but I think, as I said, what I'm thinking of it is technology and or commercial readiness. And ideally, of course, we want to be progressing against the commercial readiness. We want the development of what's the value proposition, what's the market, and that sort of thing, as well as the developing the technology, service or product. Yeah,
I'm gonna, James Wilkie is Birmingham has asked a question about the ecosystem, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment, James, don't worry. But I wanted to ask you about what do you think the real problem is you're trying to solve in this role? There are plenty of people who have this, who cleave to the adage that the UK is really good at research and not very good at innovation. And I think most of the people on this meeting would not agree with that. And sometimes lots of things are created to solve, to win the last war, as it were. So I know you've got more of a nuanced view on it than that, and I wonder if you could be a bit more explicit about what you think the role is trying to solve.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that, I think there's both an internal and a wider ecosystem view for the role. I think and there's an overlap in the middle, of course. So I think internally, if you look at the variety of schemes, and there are some, quite a lot of schemes, and and not insignificant funding within UKRI for commercialisation, although I would like to have a greater funding that we would be able to fund. But I think, as I touched upon, that for very good reasons, because UKRI is bringing together, a number of different organisations that were independent in their own right before, it means that we have quite a wide variety of doing things. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but what we do need to do, I think, is to use best evidence to decide, actually, are some things working better than others? And if so, let's promote the things that we can. But I think also, and back to the bureaucracy, I think, certainly with some of our schemes, the impact acceleration accounts, for example, we have universities that are having to apply a number of times. The rules are slightly different, use of funding slightly different. Now, as I said, I don't mind plurality of models, but actually I think there is a job that needs to be done there to make things easier and to harmonise the funding for impact acceleration account, as one example. And we've been just agreed last week, actually, that we're going to do that. So I think that's one sort of problem that does need to be solved, that sort of internally. But also, I think if you look also across the skills piece within UKRI, again, a number of different schemes aiming to increase skills and capacity for commercialisation. Again, each of them individually generated for the reason and probably doing a good job. But, if we're thinking about, do we want to scale up our funding and support for skills, we need to have an idea about what's working well and what's kind of models. Again, I don't believe a one-size-fits-all model is right, but, we need to be able to think about what basis we want to scale things up. So I think there's that part of the job. That's quite sort of internal, because I think there is a job internally within UKRI to do that. I think the other things, I think, is the focus of UKRI on commercialisation. Now, I don't think everyone, certainly I think is, actually been very pleased with the UKRI about how welcome people have made me. And I think that, and the posts have been created for a reason. But I think there's lots more to be done within UKRI about waving the flag for the importance of commercialisation. And my ambition would be to make sure that we got full discipline and council coverage for funding for commercialisation, which we don't have yet, for example. So I think there is certainly an internal job that needs to be done there. But that links very clearly with, I think, increasing UKRI's profile within government and within the ecosystem for an organisation that believes in commercialisation, alongside, funding fundamental research, alongside other forms of impact. As I said, it's not the impact, but absolutely increasing UKRI as an organisation that values and wants to support commercialisation for UK PLC. So I think there's a role there, I think. And just to pick on your point, I certainly don't believe that as I probably wouldn't be doing this job, that the UK is good at research. Yes, it is good at research. I think the actual metrics show that actually the UK is good at commercialisation, and I think that said, there are areas that we need to think about. I say for UKRI, we don't have total coverage of disciplines, and if you look at the country, there's not necessarily equal, or we know there's not equal sort of commercialisation activity in the country. Again, there could be good reasons for that, but I think we need to think about why is that, and are there things that we could do as a partnership working together to try and tackle that. Yeah.
So if you you're thinking about your first tasks, your first 6 months of activity in this role, one of those tasks is clearly about coming up with a harmonised approach across UKRI, certainly the research councils. And you said that you've made some progress with that, so they're already starting to agree the principle, at least, I think, if I understood you rightly. So would that would mean that all of the impact accelerator accounts, for example, would have similar rules or similar terminology or similar milestones, that sort of thing? Is that what you're thinking of?
So we agreed. We had agreement last week from the exec chairs and from Smart Walport to basically implement changes to the impact acceleration accounts. Now, first of all, the key first part of that is engaging with the community, and we obviously need to develop, and we've obviously would love to engage with your membership, but also we need to develop a good sort of engagement plan to test this, although of course we have done some of that already. But yeah, so what we've agreed is, in principle, is to have a harmonised single model for impact acceleration account funding. that we'll do a couple of things. It won't change the remit, so they will continue to fund broad remit, not just commercialisation, broad impact, I should say, not just commercialisation. But the vision is that a university would apply once to UKRI for impact acceleration account funding. Now that may be subdivided into different disciplines linked to different councils. The councils will still do the individual review, but there will be a single application and also single reporting, monitoring, etc. Is also going to be key of that. And absolutely, the idea is that we will harmonise the rules for the funding. It should be longer, ideally longer term funding, sort of 3 to 5 years type awards. So university will be able to plan what that. But also, as I say, we'll be able to harmonise the rules for what the success measures that look like, really. But understanding that there will be need to be discipline specific differences in how you measure. It needs to be discipline sensitive, I think, really. Yeah. So that's been agreed, and we plan to be implementing and start an implementation over the next couple of months for that process. We've also agreed that we want to develop what's called a commercial sort of translation and commercialization catalyst framework that would bring the later stage translation and commercialization programs together under sort of catalyst type model. So what we mean by that is the funding such as follow-on funding, DPFS for Medical Research Council, etc., would continue to happen in the way that they are happening. But when if someone is applying for commercialization funding, as we define it, and as we've defined it, within that, there would be, again, harmonized sort of application process. Again, the review will still be done by the councils, but there will be a more harmonized process for application review and monitoring of that commercialization funding.
Yeah, and I think that would be really welcomed, and I've already got some comments on the chat about that being really, really helpful. I suppose the question, it comes back to a question that Liz Flint has asked, which is about where do you prioritise? There's going to be increasing pressure on public funds, one suspects, although we would all hope that investing in the future for this kind of thing would be seen as important. But if you're applying to a general if you're applying through a general UKRI common framework, are you likely to find that actually really there'll only be success for anything related to pandemics at the moment, and anything related to the creative industries, for example, would be somehow less important? How will that be? Will there be challenges, or do you see a way in which it might be framed for people so that they can engage with that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. We are in an unprecedented sort of economic environment at the moment, and clearly we've all been waiting for a spending review for some time. And when that does happen, it will be, I think, a tough spending review. So that we need to bear that in mind, I think, clearly. That said, I think, I think the acknowledgement and the need to fund, as I said, the basic discovery research and the commercialization and translation of that research is very much still there. I think that's an argument that has been won. Probably need to continue making it, but it has been won. So I think the idea is that we would absolutely want to ensure that we have sort of responsive modes funding for commercialization. It's not to say that we might as well, particularly if we get a positive settlement in the spending review, think about targeting specific areas, and that may or not be pandemic. There could be other, there are lots of other priorities in clean growth, for example, could be another example. So it's not to say that the idea about a catalyst, it would allow us to identify themes, but I think we fundamentally believe that we'd want to keep a responsive element to that. And all the programs I've talked about have a responsive element. So we are keen to be responsive to the best research and the best commercialization out there, not just focus that into a certain areas. I think that wouldn't be within the UKRI sort of remit to do that. So I think we need, but absolutely, as you say, I'm sure there will be themes that we may want to highlight. The key is, as you say, is not to do that at the expense of that responsive, keeping that responsive sort of view and angle to our schemes.
Yeah, I saw the data this morning that showed that Innovate UK had done more, that handled more bids in the last 6 weeks than it had in the whole of the last year, because of people responding to those immediate demands. So I think you're right. We're going to need to have that ability to focus on things in the short term. Just on the question of the catalysts, there are various models that you could take for that. And coming back to Adam's question right at the beginning was about, you know, what might be the commercial model for those. Are you thinking it will be a kind of more like a proof of concept type initiative, or would you eventually see UKRI moving into a kind of taking shares in ventures and somehow expecting a return from investments?
So I think the important thing is that there's a number of schemes existing already where commercialization is one activity, again, alongside the other activities we talked about: translation, knowledge exchange, business engagement. First of all, it's really important to say that we're not saying that we want to take all the money from those activities and put them into commercialization. There needs to be that sort of blend of those different interlinked sort of activities of knowledge exchange, business engagement, commercialization. So that's the first thing to say. Those schemes that we're talking about, as I say, fund commercialization already. We would like to have more money for commercialization, and that's certainly an aim, although that is subject to spending reviews, etc. But I think what we're trying to do here is come about it from two bits. Obviously, we want to continue a researcher-led, researcher-focused commercialization funding aim, and the aim there, I don't think, well, certainly it's something we do need to look at in the longer term, but in the short term, there aren't plans to think about that. You know, this is will still be grant-based funding. You know, and there's no plans to change the IP, you know, around that for that, around the UKRI grant-based funding. Of course, we also then want to link it to Innovate UK funding for businesses, and they, of course, as you know, do take a different approach in terms of equity, grants, loans, etc. And that again will stay the same. So they will still use their mechanisms for funding business and industry. But what we want to do is bring those two more closely together. So we want a better sort of seamless continuum of funding, is the term, really, between researcher-driven to business-driven commercialization. But we're not planning, certainly in the short term, to think about, you know, that we would change the basis and the IP arrangements around our grants. Yeah.
Okay, and that's really helpful. And I think there's been a couple of comments on the chat about the kind of longevity of funding being almost as important as the focus, you know, and other questions about how it's structured. You know, just knowing that it's there and that we can begin to call on it makes a real difference.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the key things is, I think what we'd like to do is both the IIA funding and the Catalyst funding to be longer term, so that sort of longer term stage gated type funding that would allow researchers, universities to be able to plan, and small SMEs to be able to plan on the basis that they've got more funding. Obviously, it will be stage gated along the sort of TRL, CRL type model yet to be agreed. And again, there won't be a single size. That stage gating will need to be dependent on the individual projects and the individual disciplines. But that sort of framework of that stage gating, I think, is what we want to introduce. But that would ideally allow us to take a longer term view on funding and potentially manage risks in a better way and take more risks potentially, because obviously there's, you know, you have to accept there's going to be an element of projects that are not going to continue on to commercialization, and that's the nature of it. And I think that's fine. And I think you need a balanced portfolio of risk in this area, in my view.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. I'm going to move on now to the ecosystem questions, which we had earlier in the chat. But I think let's start with what. So first of all, it's a pretty complex ecosystem across the piece, and we all remember the Dowling review diagrams with arrows going in all kinds of directions and lots of blobs and circles. But right in the heart of that were universities and businesses. playing together. And you have the whole question of regional parts of the ecosystem, you have the national parts, you have the sector-driven activities. Just on the sort of that key relationship, businesses and universities and the industrial strategy, should we be thinking about, in terms of our future commercialization plans, and thinking about, you know, how we might engage with the initiatives that might come out from your work, should we be thinking the industrial strategy themes are still the priorities in government? Are those being changed as you know, as time moves on? What's the dovetailing on that side from your point of view?
So I think there's, so as I said, so I think first of all, I think UKRI genuinely is interested in the broad range of disciplines and areas of research and commercialization. So absolutely, in terms of the themes, I mean, I think it are the, I mean, obviously I'm not, the UKRI is, I used to be a civil servant, I'm not a civil servant per se in this job, we're a non-departmental public body. And it's based, of course, and number 10 that we'll be working and agreeing that the sort of the themes for these, you know, the relevant themes are linked to industrial strategy. But I think a lot of them are still very valid at the moment, and I think obviously there's a particular focus on things like clean growth and that sort of thing. But I think a lot of the ones that are published around the ISCF are still very relevant at the moment. We've still got a number of initiatives, you know, that you know, the challenges that we have, challenge funding that we have, are still very much active and working. So I think they are relevant at the moment. But I say for us and for me, what I want to do is make sure there's a balance to make sure that we are addressing those, but not exclusively addressing those. We need to have that room for that truly responsive mode as well, I think.
So come back to the these sort of intermeshing elements of the ecosystem. You could look at your role and say, well, there's another bit now, which is, you know, it adds another complication into the system. How are we going to handle all that? Can you give us your thoughts on how your role might help us to streamline all of these things?
So yeah, so I think so I don't think there's another bit, because that bit, as I said, has always been active in terms of commercialisation. So as I say, UKRI and the councils have been funding commercialisation activity for a while. So what we're trying to do is just knit that together and I guess make the sum greater than the parts in terms of UKRI funding. We'll come on to the ecosystem in a second. So, but I think, and I think so that's the first thing. I think the issue is, as far as I'm concerned, I'm really passionate at saying that I can't do my job in a bubble of thinking just about commercialization, though. I absolutely need to understand that when it comes to university business interactions, that there is that wider gamut, and appropriately, of those interactions. You know, you've got wider knowledge exchange, which is key for universities, you know, and actually, you know, many universities, you know, put a lot of effort appropriately, and it's successful, you know. I think so, you know, and also for some areas, you know, particularly around the, you know, medical but not medical, you've got translation, which is, you know, where commercialization isn't a direct, you know, intended outcome, but you still want to translate from basic discovery science into, you know, into people, into the labs, you know, etc. So I think we just need to understand that, and I certainly need to bear in mind there's that, and need to remember that what we are doing in commercialization doesn't have an unintended consequence of decreasing the other activity, because that's not, I think we need to try to do that. It's not the best answer, because it is a tricky, complex environment, but I think the key take-home message for me is that, as I say, I'm not trying to, and I don't think UKRI is trying to say it's commercialization instead of those other activities. We want to continue, and I think that's been fundamental when I talked about the impact acceleration accounts and the commercialization catalyst, is that, you know, it's one of the things that we fleshed out in that is that we want those activities and those schemes to continue funding the broader remit of impact.
is there likely to be, given the intersection on this ecosystem with regional dimensions, and a lot of the people on in this meeting will be interested in how you can use national resources to drive regional improvements in GDP and performance generally. Are you thinking at all about how national resources can play into regional priorities?
So I think yes, absolutely. The short answer is yes, and what I'm really doing is keen to work with regions and universities across England, but also as well as the world administrations, to think about actually what we want is a joint narrative, really, that together we can say, well, what is the role of commercialization, and what are the USPs potentially in that region, or country, if we're talking about Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, what are the USPs in those areas that actually that we can say there's a joint narrative and say, well, the importance of commercialization in this region or country is X, and that will allow us to have a joint narrative, I think, when we're thinking about how do we try to get increased funding for commercialization, because I think everyone thinks do that. So I think absolutely, I think it's and I think it's really interesting talking to some the regions that I've talked to so far about commercialization, is that of course there is a willingness, and what's interesting of course is not everyone, but I think pretty much is interesting that where people are really keen, of course, to identify what their USPs are, what the ecosystem. We use the ecosystem word a lot, but between the universities and local businesses is what is the distinct flavour there, and how can commercialization help that interaction really, and what's the benefits for that? And I think, but what I'm keen to do is talk to and meet with, and I've obviously done that with a number of organisations so far. So if any members, I've talked to, GW4, N8, for example, West Midlands, Scotland, Wales, and that's relative early in this. I want to talk East of England, for example. So keen to talk to regions to find out what are the drivers locally, and how do we, as I say, come to get a joint sort of narrative in this area.
And many of us spent a lot of time developing science and innovation audits for our areas. And I don't think we'd all want to start again on that piece of work. So it'd be useful to find ways of connecting that back to your work. So, because I think a lot of the big priorities came up in those, which were they were reasonably clear, I think, but not every area did want. But I just hope you're not going to start from scratch. So
I'm certainly not going to be going to regions and saying do science and innovation audits. I'm certainly not going to be doing that. But absolutely, I think it's building on where they have them in terms of finding out are they within the regionals sort of plans and ambitions for growth, and where do they fit in. But I think for me, as I say, is identifying the strengths, and every area has them, of course, but what is that strength between the university business interactions? Where are the strengths, and some areas are particularly strong in certain disciplines, and what's the USP around that? But for me, as I say, what we want to do is we're keen to open up our funding, I guess, from the UK. Well, I'm really keen that we open up our funding, and that we try to match our funding. I think one of the key success is whether we match our funding on the actual potential and capacity for commercialization, not just on where the research funding's going. That's an important element, but what we're keen to do is well, how do we make sure our funding is matched to what's the real opportunities for commercialization? And that will be different in each area at different universities as well. I think that's a great opportunity for potentially some universities and some disciplines that perhaps haven't had so much access to UKRI funding before.
And there are significant parts of the country which have a lot of research funding, but which have less funding going to industry. And so those two things don't necessarily correlate. And it'd be interesting to get your thoughts on how you see your work helping direct money to business organizations as well as to universities as part of this whole ecosystem thing that we're trying to improve?
So I think that's where obviously the partnership with Innovate UK comes in. I mean, Innovate UK within UKRI is the organisation that funds business-led commercialisation innovation. And I think if any, and I think the issue there is, again, how do we have a system where there's better sort of joint working between the Research Council and Innovate UK? There already is in many areas, but how do we make sure that there is that? And I think that's the secret. So how do we try to make sure that and if you take, and that does happen, so if you take the existing catalysts, for example, biomedical catalysts as one example, that already happens to a degree. But I think there's a couple of things that perhaps we could also focus on. So we've got researcher-led sort of commercialization, and we've got industry-led commercialization. The bit that we really need to focus on as well, I think, is, and again, it happens a lot, but are we really optimizing the environment for commercialization that comes out of collaboration between researchers and business, or business-driven challenge, problem-driven, collaborations, and are we really maximizing commercialization out of those?
And there tends to be a kind of people like to keep these things in separate boxes, don't they? And actually, they often, collaborations often lead to, well, they should lead to outcomes of some kind, but people often then think, well, now I've got to do another bit of work to achieve the outcome of it all. Can I go back to a question that Carol Barron from Kent asked earlier on in the chat, which is about the skills needed for supporting commercialization and innovation. She was particularly focused on student engagement in this activity, and you may have a view on that. But I wondered if there's a strand of your work that's going to focus on building up skills at various levels.
Yeah, so I think skills is absolutely key. I know it's an obvious answer, but I think it's absolutely key. And I think what we need to do is look across the board at different stages of career development and the skills needed for that. And I think there's two bits really. There are obviously, I guess, we want to make sure that people that really want to and are inspired to be and lead sort of commercialization of their research, for example, they have the appropriate skills, support, etc., to do that. We also need to think about, well, genuinely, when we're training researchers or we're funding PhDs and postdocs, etc., what's the minimum level of awareness, at least, so skills would we expect people to have around commercialization? Now, of course, you might put that under the banner of entrepreneurship, working with industry, whatever, and commercialization may only be one bit of that. But I think it's really important. So, and I think, and I think, particularly for UKRI, focusing on PhDs and postdocs, particularly, what's the kind of level of knowledge? What we would like is a next generation of researchers, but also not just researchers, bearing in mind that many PhDs and postdocs, of course, don't stay in academia. They go out into the wider, industry ecosystem sort of thing, or other sectors. And what's their understanding of the importance and the advantages and benefits of working with industry and of commercialization? Yeah.
So we can expect to see some kinds of programs targeting skills development in researchers.
So I think, yes. So I think there's two aspects to this. There's Innovate UK are already working on the skills for within industry for commercialization. How do we develop those? There are a number of schemes already, again, within UKRI that directly focused on increasing skills and capacity in commercialization. We've got Innovation Fellows, Innovation Scholars, IUK, again, within Innovate UK. The question is, do we want to scale those up and what works well? And I think that's the kind of thing that I'm really keen to look at. And then there's a longer term question, as I said, is, what's the level of skills and awareness we want PhDs and early career researchers to come out of their training with?
Yeah, I think that's really, really, really helpful. And I think there may be a role for PraxisAuril in helping with some of that as well. Just to take it out to a bit more of beyond the regions, beyond the country stage. So just a question about international collaboration, international commercialization. Do you see yourself helping to encourage, we feel as if we're in a global business here with lots of international connections. Sometimes the rules for domestic government funding mean it's harder to do some of those international initiatives. Have you got anything in mind on that broader global ecosystem?
So yeah, I mean, I think absolutely we are absolutely in a global environment when it comes to commercialization, and I think we need to, well, one, we need to see are there lessons to be learned from other countries, and some countries, oh no, actually UK's ranked pretty, as you know, pretty highly in this, but are there lessons to learn, particularly around this new and emerging disciplines, for example, like AI and that sort of thing, other things that we can learn. So I think we absolutely need to keep an eye on globally. I think the other thing to bear in mind, of course, is, as you say, I mean, I think we also need to appreciate, and this is often said this is a bad thing, that the outcome of commercialization sometimes is things going overseas, being bought out or whatever. Now, I actually don't see that in itself as inherently a bad thing. Because it increases the country's reputation for a place, as a country that's bringing these ideas, and emerging these ideas to a stage that can be commercialized. That's a success. Bringing in with investment, etc. So I think that actually is not a bad thing. What we want to say is there's still questions, though, around how, are we growing enough SMEs, etc., and keeping them in house. So there's still questions to ask. But I think absolutely we need to make sure that we understand what the global environment is for commercialization, and many of us will know, we often cite examples of the US examples, etc., where they do this well. Should we be learning from this? But as I said, actually we do well as a country. We shouldn't I know you're not, we absolutely shouldn't be criticizing where we are as a country, but I think there's always room for improvement, and we need to do that and understand that also we can't stand still. Same as everything, the rest of the world will be increasing and promoting and getting better. We need to do that at least to stay still.
Yes, but it might be that the best way of commercializing something might be to build a partnership with an organization based in Japan, and it would be good to know that we could rely on UKRI to support us in that. Absolutely,
yeah, of course, and I think and the global collaborations absolutely, I think, are really important, and I think, and as I said, that's something that we should be seeing as a success, I think, really.
Yeah. Okay, so last couple of questions, because we're coming to the end of our time. There's a couple of questions in the chat which you might want to look at separately, Tony, afterwards. One relating to KEF. And how that might affect how you go about thinking about things, the clusters in KEF, which I think is quite interesting. And another question about specific schemes, which are more about building relationships between the businesses and universities, like the Prosperity Partnership Scheme. And it would be, perhaps not now, but perhaps you might want to think about that and come back to us about whether those fall within your remit. I'd like to just ask you a final question, which is really about the future of research and innovation funding. Where we are at the moment, spending reviews, difficult situation, your role with this focus on commercialization. Do you see funding ending up being more slanted towards impact and outcomes as you go along? Do you see a continued commitment from government and others into broader research programs? What's your feeling on the inside track?
So my
2 minutes.
Feeling, yeah, of course. My feeling is that there's, within government at the moment, there's still absolutely the acknowledgement of the need to fund basic discovery, science and research. So I think the importance of that is high at the moment. So certainly not all about impact or commercialization. So I think that's the first thing. I think it has been difficult, as you know. Research councils have had, universities have had a decrease in real terms for funding. So I think we'd want to absolutely try to address that in future spending reviews. But I think absolutely, I do think that there is at the same time, and it's not instead of, but it's as well as that increased focus on impact and commercialization. And I think there is an opportunity to think about, and it's not instead of, hopefully, but it's in addition. The idea is that this will be an addition, that we will get increased funding for commercialization within that. But ideally, that's not instead, because we don't want that trade-off.
Okay, well, that's a brilliant point at which to end. Thank you very much, Tony, for joining us in the shed today, and for bringing your own shed with you. It's very, very impressive.